Hey everyone, welcome back to another lesson, and in this one we are looking at the technologies available to us to help get on top of your diabetes management. Now, it's never been easy to manage type 1 diabetes, but in recent years there has been an explosion of options to help track glucose data. And this has been helpful for both us, the clinicians, who are looking at your glucose trends, and it's also been invaluable to patients who can see glucose data that they never had access to before. So throughout the course, and particularly when we get to more in-depth strategies, we'll be talking a bit more about those in-between glucose points that previously you wouldn't have seen, and that these technologies have allowed us to gain access to. If you're not using them, don't worry too much about it. You can still get those data points if you just test your glucose levels, but I do appreciate it's more finger pricks. The purpose of this video as well is to actually just show you a little bit about these technologies, to show you how they work, and actually give you a bit more information about them should you be wondering whether or not it's for you. So let's jump right in. So the two I'm going to be referring to is the Freestyle Libre device and the Dexcom. Now these essentially achieve the same thing to a certain degree, but they are slightly different. So a Freestyle Libre device is what we call a flash glucose monitor. So flash glucose means that you still need to scan it in order for it to initiate its glucose tracking device, whereas a Dexcom is a continuous glucose monitor, which means you just put it on you and it will start tracking your glucose data. So how does this differ from conventional care? So historically, you would do blood tests at certain points in the day, before breakfast, before lunch, before dinner, before evening, and any extra glucose points you want to do in order to get extra insights. But these are kind of be your bog standard. Now, the problem with this is it only gives you a point in time. So you don't know what's happening between the meals and you don't know what's happening overnight. The only way you're going to know that is if you test more or you're setting an alarm overnight to see what's happening. But even then, that overnight alarm is still only giving you a single point in time. So you might wake up at 2 a.m, test your glucose, things are looking okay, glucose levels are 6, but you might be on the downward trajectory, and by 3 a.m, you're actually in a hypo. You wouldn't know that, particularly if you don't pick up your hypo symptoms. So that's how it used to be. Whereas these devices now give us access to tracking your glucose levels 24 hours a day. They will plot glucose every minute, 24 hours a day. Now, what that will look like then is, rather than just these points in time, we start to get data that looks a bit more like this. So you see the post-meal rises, you might get a spike, you might get a bit of a hypo perhaps, and then the treatment of the hypo. So you can already see, just in terms of the points in time, how much more valuable this is, because we can start to look at what the effect is of your dietary choices, how your insulin timings are going. There's so much extra value we can bring out of this. Now with the Freestyle Libre, if you're not familiar with the device, it's a little disc that sits on the back of the arm. And we say the arm because that's where it's calibrated. So we don't recommend wearing it anywhere else at the moment, because they just haven't calibrated it for anywhere else. So it's still the back of the arm as it stands. And then what you need to do for this 24-hour glucose data set is to just scan it every 8 hours. So it can store up to 8 hours. So as long as you scan it every 8 hours, you'll get a 24-hour period. If you go longer than 8 hours before scanning it, you'll start to get breaks in the data. Now, to get a Freestyle Libre, we don't want you to just scan 3 times a day. You want to be using it as much as possible, scanning lots of times, and the CCGs will generally want you to be scanning at least 8 times a day to get the most out of it, because it's not just about not pricking your finger, it's about getting the most out of these devices. The Dexcom, on the other hand, does this automatically. So it just inserts into the stomach, generally speaking, that's where you'll wear it, but you can wear it in other places if you want to. But you don't have to scan it, it will just track your glucose data. Now the other big difference between these two, other than the fact that you don't need to scan the Dexcom, is the Dexcom's actually alarmed. So if you're going into a hypo, it will tell you about it. So one of the big criteria to gain access to a Dexcom is hypo unawareness. So people that aren't picking up their hypos at all, or you might be picking up the hypo well below 4 millimoles per litre. So this will kick in and tell you that you're on for a hypo. Really valuable. The Freestyle Libre, the first one at least, doesn't have that capability, but you can buy an adapter called a Meow Meow. It's a very weird name, but I don't name them, which attaches to the Libre, and then that'll act as an alarm as well. The Freestyle Libre 2, which at the time of filming is coming to market as we speak, does have the alarm, and there's actually a Freestyle Libre 3 in the works, but let's not run before we can walk, and perhaps over time we'll update this session as more and more of these come out. And whether or not that will be a continuous glucose monitor rather than a flash glucose monitor, time will tell. I'm not sure at this point. But that's what these can do. So this allows us then to get a bit more specialized with our advice, which is the in-depth strategies we'll be talking about later in the course, because previously we wouldn't have seen that spike, so there's nothing that we can do about it. Now don't get me wrong, if you're testing your glucose levels at these 4 time points in the day and they're all in target and your HbA1c is in target and you're not getting regular hypos, chances are your glucose levels in between is actually pretty good. But if you're someone that was seeing that you're doing your 4 tests in the day and your glucose levels are generally in target, but your HbA1c is a shock to you, it's a lot higher than you thought it would be, this is happening. So now we can see it, so it's so much better. Now the other beautiful thing about these types of technology is they give us also access to the direction of travel of your glucose levels. So for example, the Freestyle Libre, when you scan it, not only does it give you the glucose level at the time, but it also tells you the direction of travel. So you can see if you're going down, so usually when you're going to do your carbohydrate ratio or your correction dose, when you just test on the finger, you're almost giving it a little bit blindly. You know what the glucose level is, but you might be on the way down. So you give your normal correction dose and actually it's just going to exacerbate the problem and push you into a hypo. Whereas now you could scan and say, oh, actually the glucose level is going downwards. I'm already 8. Maybe I shouldn't give as much insulin as I was going to give, just to prevent that hypo from happening. So it just gives you much more informed decisions about what you're doing on the ground. So really handy pieces of technology. Both have their own respective websites. If you want to know more about them, I'd encourage you to go check it out or speak with your diabetes team. There are criteria to go on them. It's beyond the scope of this video to discuss that. It's widely available, or just speak with your GP, your diabetes nurse, or your diabetes team, and they can talk to you more about it. But in future videos throughout the course, we will be referring to some of the data that these technologies have allowed us to see. If you don't have one of these technologies, don't worry, you can still benefit from the information, so stick with us. It just might mean that in order to gain access to that glucose data, you have to do a few extra finger pricks, or actually see if you can organize yourself a trial of one of these devices, or even try and get it on prescription. So you actually have the information ready, loaded in the gun, which means then you can pull the trigger once you start to see the glucose trends because you'll understand them. Okay, so we'll leave it there, guys, and we will see you at the next lesson.